Hey, so today what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about peace, and this is the first in a series of a few reflections exploring the theme of peace. And Lord knows we could do with a bit of it, right? I think many of us sense that internally, right? Anxiety and unsettledness and agitation and drivenness, these are the kind of hallmarks of modern life. And so many of us could do with a bit of peace. And also, the world at the moment is a conflicted place. And I think a lot of us are grappling with what to do about that and how to respond to that and what our posture should be toward that and how do we relate to injustice and all of that kind of stuff. This is big stuff that's going on in the world. And the story of Jesus and the way of Jesus continues, I think, to offer us wisdom and insight and I guess kind of spiritual resources really for how we might grapple with this notion of peace and experience it and cultivate it and curate it, both within ourselves and also with one another. As a way of kind of grounding that, these ancient stories, and you'll find them in Genesis if you pick up a Bible or a phone, I guess, or the internet, and look at the beginning of Genesis. And these were these kind of ancient origin stories that the ancient Hebrew people told. And they were not the only stories being told in the ancient world, but they were certainly one collection of these stories. And many of the ancient stories in the world talked about a creation. I think they looked around at the world and they said, look, the world is a conflicted, competitive, sometimes hostile and violent place. And so that must be just the way things are. That's the way the gods are. Lots of those ancient stories involve conflict between the gods, sometimes the death of one god to create the world or to create human beings made as savages or as slaves, and they were kind of annoying, and the gods were always getting sort of bothered by the humans. And that was kind of a reflection on experience of the world, and so therefore that must be what things are like, and that must be what the gods are like too. And one of the radical kind of ideas that's captured in the ancient Hebrew creation stories, and we're not sure exactly when they're written, but certainly probably after their kind of exit from slavery in Egypt, there is this reflection within them that God might not be like that God might be a God who desires peace rather than domination, that God might be one who creates human beings for relationship rather than for servitude. And there's this ancient idea, right, in the Hebrew language of shalom, which we often translate as peace, something like that. And what it's reflecting on, and theologians and scholars of these texts talk about the way in which we see that kind of harmony or that shalom or that peace play out in those early stories is in our relatedness to God, but also to each other, to the self, and then to nature or to creation. And so their reflection of their kind of origin story of humankind and of their understanding of God is that things are intended for peace and harmony and love and relationship rather than conflict, hostility, violence, shame, all of that kind of stuff. And that is the prism in many respects through which many of the ancient people who followed these stories saw the world, and then Jesus in that tradition and in that context, and Jesus' early followers. When they thought about what it meant to be human in the world and what it meant to be in community with one another, also thought about what this kind of vision of peace looks like. And this is kind of central to Jesus' notion of what the presence of the kingdom of God might look like. And so if we're going to think about peace, then we're not just talking about this sense of kind of internal settledness or calm, right? Although that may very well be a part of it. And that's what we hope for ourselves. But that it's not just this modern kind of individualist kind of thing where it's just something that I experience, and as long as I have peace, then everything's fine. But it's our intersectedness, our interrelatedness with one another. It's not me just finding a place where I'm not experiencing any conflict, but it's how do we together build healthier forms of connectedness and relatedness to one another. So it's the interior journey, and it's also this external journey of how we relate to God and to others and to creation itself. So I think what we see in the life of Jesus and in the way in which he lives is he spends a lot of his time working to in fact, tear apart systems, right? Especially religious ones, actually, that robbed people of dignity, of belonging, of a sense of community. He was trying to move people together towards this holistic vision of shalom, of peace, of the presence of the kingdom of God. So he wasn't just wanting to, and this is sometimes the way of Jesus is boiled down to, he's going to make us right with God so that we can go to heaven one day, and so on. And that's a very kind of individualist kind of, this is about me and my relationship to God kind of perspective on peace and on the work of Jesus. But Jesus spent a lot of his time and attention saying, how are we going to relate to one another, right? And so if the system is crushing some to give power and peace to others, then it's not shalom, it's not real peace. And in fact, this is not just a critique of religious systems in his time, it's a critique of the Roman Empire, through whom it was peace by domination. Yes, we shall establish peace in the world, but it's by crushing our enemies and crucifying the rebels. So that's kind of what we see a bit in the story of Jesus. And then the letters that we find in the New Testament as well, a lot of them written by Paul, are grappling not just with our kind of vertical, so to speak, relationship with God, but how are we going to relate to one another? How are we going to treat one another? How are we going to form community together in a way that fosters and cultivates peace instead of judgment and exclusion? And you can see, early Christians, you can see even early followers of Jesus, his disciples, right, and other religious leaders around him struggling to kind of figure out what is he doing here? What's he on about? Because one of the radical things he's doing, he keeps extending this circle of love and of shalom. Extends it to neighbor, but his definition of neighbor is very inclusive and seems to include the people that they didn't like, strangers and foreigners and unclean people and ostracized people and marginalized folk. And in fact, he extends this vision all the way to his enemies, to our enemies, and says, love your enemies. Right? This is the path to peace and to shalom. Now, as we'll see as we go along in these reflections, that doesn't mean an absence of justice, but it is this commitment to see the humanity and dignity of all people, and that somehow that's got something to do with peace. It's this big, beautiful, cosmic, challenging vision of peace. And so, following the way of Jesus, what does it do? It invites us to reflect on our posture toward the world including self, toward God, toward others, toward creation. Are we tempted, like the Roman Empire was in Jesus' day, to see the world and those in it as something to be dominated? Do we see the world primarily through kind of competition, scarcity? Are we tempted, perhaps like many of the religious people were in Jesus' day, and, dare I say it, are still now? Often a temptation of religious culture is to foster this us versus them attitude, to have the insiders and the outsiders, and the insiders feel this sense of being in something that means they're able to judge those who are outside that. Ironically, that often leads to a real harsh judgment of ourselves. And so we end up in our own inner conflicts and battles against our own bodies. And so this kind of posture of like conflict and battle and domination or competition or us versus them, all of that kind of closes us down in our sort of posture to the world. And so the invitation, I think, through the way of Jesus and what we see him doing so often is cultivating this posture of kind of openness. He was so open to the different experiences of people who otherwise would be immediately written off. And he creates space and he creates room at the table, and and so what would it look like for us to cultivate this posture of openness, of looking to embrace? Now, the world is a kind of crazy place. So this is not straightforward. But at the very least, Miroslav Volf, theologian, talks about this idea of embrace at least being kind of our default paradigm. Our default posture is openness to the world and to one another. And then, if we have to figure things out, then we do. But that openness is the invitation here, rather than kind of closing down. So I want to invite you to do a practice, and you don't have to do this in real time with me. I'll just kind of describe the practice, and then I'll put the description up online for you to work your way through if you want, because you might want to do this in a place that makes most sense to you. But here's the invitation to the practice. It's to take a couple of minutes. It's to slow down. It's just like I often encourage people to do in any kind of reflective practice, is just to be able to take 2 to 3 minutes at the beginning to let yourself settle, to pay attention to your breath, to pay attention to your presence in your body. And if your mind wanders, that's fine. Just bring your attention back to the breath, or back to a word, or back to a sense of focus on God, or of your own kind of chest rising and falling, whatever it is that's going to help you get to that place. And then once you've sat in that settled place for a moment, I want you to just kind of practice 2 postures physically with your body. And the first is to kind of close yourself down, right? To maybe to put your head down. It might even be to put your chin on your chest, to wrap yourself kind of tightly up with your arms. You might even want to, depending on where you are, right? Tuck your legs in tightly as well, and kind of close in and close down. Now, there's a sense in which that could be a posture of self-care, right? Depending on where you're at and what you're going through. And so that can be a really healthy posture. But I'm thinking here about kind of our posture to the world, right? Our posture toward ourselves and towards those around us. What does it, if we're kind of closed in and closed down, and just kind of sit with that for a minute or two and think, what would it be? What is it like if I approach the world this way? If I approach other people this way? Even if I approach my own heart in this kind of way? And then once you've sat with that for a couple of minutes, then open your posture up. It might be to bring your arms out to the side, to lift your head. You might even want to open your eyes or look up or whatever it might be. And there's nothing magical about these physical postures, but it's just an invitation to experience, right? And as you kind of open up into that posture, just spend a couple of moments reflecting on, okay, what would it feel like to approach the world with this kind of openness? What would it feel like to approach God with this kind of openness, to approach my relationships with this in my workplace and family and friends? What would it look like to approach my own heart with this kind of openness and what's going on for me? And just sit with that feeling for a moment. And then you might want to say a prayer or just reflect on what it might feel like to inhabit that kind of posture in the world. All right, that'll do for today.